Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or $50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
I'm Andrew Dana Hudson. I'm a speculative fiction writer, and sometimes I wear some other hats, do some editing, do some sustainability research, do some kind of freelance futuring and narrative strategy. But for the most part, I write stories, and I try to make them useful, which I think is one of the things that this book tries to be. And I guess I should say I'm now the author of Our Shared Storm, a novel of 5 climate futures, which came out this spring.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for coming on again. I had you on last time. I think it was the first episode of this year that came out on Solarpunk, the political economy of Solarpunk, which, or at least the spirit of that episode, I think will definitely revisit it. But we will primarily be talking about this novel of yours, which obviously I recommend people to check out. It's a fascinating experiment, and obviously we'll get into why. So the book, as you said, is called Our Shared Storm, a novel of 5 climate futures. I wanted to kind of get it out of the way so that people listening don't feel like they need to have already read the book to follow a conversation. You don't have to if you're listening to this. We will be talking around the book, the themes of the book, and why books like this one, I feel, really matter, essentially. And as I said, you should get it anyway. So, like, to anchor our conversation, would you mind telling us a bit about the book? Like, what is it, like the general, plot, certain themes, that sort of thing, which we'll get into a bit more in this conversation?
Yeah, it does need some introduction, actually, because it's not your usual novel. It is 5 stories, and each story tries to be kind of the same story, but told in a different way and set in a different future. And the 5 futures are all inspired by a set of scenarios used by the IPCC and other climate modeling scholars called the shared socioeconomic pathways, the SSPs. And the SSPs have been in development for years. I mean, obviously, because I wrote this book several years ago, or I started it, and but now they are actually showing up as like the core way the IPCC talks about the different trajectories our society might take regarding climate change in the latest set of reports, the AR6, the sixth assessment report that has been coming out. I think all the parts are out now. I think it came out in the fall was the first one, the physical sciences, and we've had some really interesting pieces drop since. So, these are scholarly concepts, right? These 5 scenarios, and I'll just mention what they are real quick. SSP1 is the sort of sustainability scenario in which we do it right. We stop climate change, we decarbonize, we adapt to the climate change that is coming, stabilize the planet, and we do so in a way that generally broadens prosperity and makes everyone happier and healthier. And I guess sort of an interesting note is that in the IPCC report, they ended up using 2 versions of SSP1 because uh, I guess they have a 1.5 degree warming version which is like where they're like we hold it to 1.5 C, and then they have sort of another version where they're like, well, that seems really hard, so we might miss that, but I think we can still call it a win, and if we reach these goals at 1.7 or like just under 2C. So there's some politicking in how these things kind of uh, finally were deployed, which is very appropriate given the themes of my book. But I just used the one. Uh, SSP2 is this middle of the road scenario in which present trends continue. We've got some challenges to mitigation and adaptation. We've got some problems, but we've made some progress. It's just sort of like the most recognizable one. Like there's no one trend that kind of swerves us out of our current trajectory. SSP3 is the breakdown scenario. It's the sort of normatively the worst one, in which we don't manage to do anything about climate change, and we just sort of devolve into conflicts over dwindling fossil energy resources. SSP4 is this inequality scenario in which maybe we do manage to do a bunch of mitigation, but I think the process of paying for adaptation turns out to be expensive enough that the results are really unequal, right? The rich countries and rich people can pay for it, the poorer countries and poor people can't. And it just, the whole process of climate change deepens inequality. And then SSP5 is this high growth scenario, this fossil fueled growth scenario in which basically we don't do any mitigation. We burn all the fossil fuels we can dig up as cheap energy to power development all over the world and uh, pay for adaptation in various ways. And, consequences be damned. But business is booming. So I don't do them in that order in the book. I reorder them to create a little more of a novelistic feel, starting from the familiar in SSP2 and then moving into some of these weirder visions and then kind of coming to the sort of terrible breakdown, more dystopian possibility, and then finishing off with the happy ending, the SSP1, the sustainability scenario. So oh, and while I'm mentioning things about how they're using the report, SSP4 is not included, the inequality scenario in the final in this report, which is interesting. I think it's the argument that I heard made was that it wasn't as distinct enough of an emissions pathway to be worth including, but obviously it's very it's a touchy subject, right? Like to be approved by the powers that be. The IPCC documents are all very political in nature, sadly, and particularly the big summaries have to be vetted by all kinds of powerful interests, and so the inequality question is inconvenient for the people who are in charge.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah, so the book is basically trying to illustrate and explore and critique all these scenarios by having four core characters show up in each story, change their perspective, but in each story they're all different people living different lives because of the path that our society has taken over the coming 30 years, and specifically around climate change, around climate adaptation and mitigation. Um, and I guess sort of the last element is that the book is set at the COP, the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Right, this is the annual big climate negotiations that the UN does, and I went in 2014 in Poland in Katowice to 2018 to COP24, and it's such a interesting, unique culture that I really wanted to, uh, I guess, explore and kind of critique it. And it serves as kind of the setting and kind of the fifth character, because we see how the cop is different in each story. It's kind of becomes a different sort of institution depending on the path we choose. So uh, yeah, and hopefully it's a fun read. But I think um, the goal of the book is to uh, one, show you both the sort of dystopian possibilities and the utopian possibilities, like right next to each other, right? Not try to come down on one side or another, but show that these are live choices that we can still affect the outcome on. And two, help us understand these institutions and the politics that of the processes that we're using to try and stop climate change right now, and see the ways in which they're inadequate or the ways in which they're full of promise. Because I think it's the hardest thing human beings have ever tried to do, and we should care about the ways in which we're trying to do them. So, that was kind of a long-winded summary, but hopefully that gets us there.
No, it was fantastic. I really think one of the ways I really appreciated this book and the kind of even like the intention behind it is this idea that the future isn't just this one thing, and that there's quite a lot of agency. In some sense, you're giving back agency to the characters, if that makes sense, because there are these different scenarios, different futures, as you said, set in the year 2054, I believe, so about 30 years from now in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, at the COP. Um, and it's a way of kind of, there will be many more COPs to go before the 2054 one, assuming they go on yearly until then. Um, and every year we're making, or people in power specifically, especially, are making specific decisions that affect the COP that come after it. And what is often missing in discourses around the COP, and I mean discourse around climate change in general, is this idea that very specific decisions are being made that could be otherwise, in the sense that there are politicking, as you mentioned. This is one thing we see that even affecting the reports themselves. I should say I had two IPCC authors. When was it? One second. A few months ago, with Dr. Rupa Mukherjee and Dr. Lisa Schipper. The title of that episode was The Urgency of the IPCC Report. And we also spoke about this actually a bit. I mean, it was obviously more specifically on the report itself and that sort of thing, but we spoke about the importance of fiction. They recommended someone like Amitav Ghosh, for example, who has been talking about climate change and the unthinkable, which I know actually you reference. And so on and so forth. So there's been this, I guess. I'm curious what you think about this. Like an increased awareness, I suppose, in the past few years with stuff like solar punk, which obviously I had you on earlier this year to talk about, as well as I said before, and other like just more broadly speaking, like climate fiction. And I'll talk about this a bit more after like hearing your thoughts on this. I'm going to. I think it'll probably be done by the time this episode comes out. But I'm going to speak with Julia Steinberger, who's now a good friend, at Lausanne in Switzerland in next week, I think. And the title of that public conversation is going to be whatever the French equivalent of from the IPCC to solarpunk, or something like that is going to be called. So she will be the climate scientist in that situation. Obviously, she is a climate scientist. She has written IPCC reports and so on. And I'll be the person talking about solarpunk essentially. And what's interesting is I think it is, it's a sign that this is being taken a bit more seriously. Essentially, the role of fiction is no longer just, although lots of people were already disagreeing with this framework, I suppose. But okay, I'm gonna pin this for now. But I'm curious as to whether you think that there has been an increased awareness and the importance of importance of books like these, essentially books like this one. I mean, in tackling climate change. It's not just a you know quote unquote like reality versus fiction. That the line between these two is actually blurred in that sense.
Yeah. Well, the caveat I always give nowadays is that I think fiction is necessary but not sufficient, right? Like it is very easy for us to imagine writing all kinds of really compelling uh, climate fiction stories and creating climate art and doing all this culture making and still not being able to pass policy. Um, so it is, but it is, I think, really hard to imagine us getting policy without all this culture making happening, right? It's hard to imagine the kind of culture wide, civilization wide mobilization that we need happening if we aren't telling stories and creating art and like making it um, into our, you know, we got to manufacture some consent here a little bit, right? Like it is um, that we need to kind of get people on board with this project, um, and culture making is a way that we do that, right? It's how we got people on board with um, petroculture projects like cars everywhere and highways, right? TV and movies played a huge role in sort of spurring the glamorization of the open highway and that sort of thing. um, but to your question, are people changing? Yeah, I think so. Um, Amitav Ghosh wrote his book in 2016, 2017. I think The Great Derangement, which is a really interesting text and kind of calling out specifically the literary community of why there wasn't a lot of literature about climate change, given that this was a thing that was going to matter to people, right? Like we have literature about war and disease and all these other sort of axes of human suffering, slavery and discrimination and all this, but there just hadn't been much literature that took the threat of climate change seriously. Um, you know, caveat there being in the literary sort of community, right? Not the science fiction community. So you talk to science fiction writers about Amitav Ghosh's book, and they're like, "Well, screw that guy. I've been writing about climate change for 30 years." Um, and I think that's fair. Um, but but it's nonetheless a very interesting book, and I think it changed a lot of minds. And so we are seeing a lot of literature, sort of capital L literary writers tackling climate change or including climate change, or honestly being really speculative, um, like breaking out of breaking into sort of other genre territory a bit, because there's no other way to talk about these sort of unfolding issues. And we've had a lot of good books, a lot of good projects, and like last year, Stan Robinson took his Ministry for the Future book on the road to COP26 and did like a huge number of events and different kinds of uh, it was, and it seemed, hearing him report it back, that there is, in the halls of power and in this sort of diplomatic world, like an increasing interest in these kinds of imaginary or imagination based tools to help us grasp and grok and talk about the problem. And ministry is a great one. And, I think my book is also a contribution. I'm hoping to find a way to make it to COP27 this year so I can like put it in the hands of some of these people that, the book is really about, right? Because it's about the people who go every year to the COP to try to save the world and are doing so kind of badly. Um, that's, and they all know it, right? So um, hopefully that'll find it. That'll be useful too. Um, and there's lots of small ways that this stuff is showing up in kind of bigger popular culture. Uh, The new Batman movie is like weirdly a climate like the true enemy is the sea, right? Like spoiler alert that the big um the as much as it's about like the Riddler and Bruce Wayne brooding, right? Like the big disaster happens because Gotham has to be protected by a seawall now.
Mm.
And if you blow up the seawall, you flood the city. And, I think that's like a really kind of, it wasn't, I didn't love the movie, but I thought that was a really contemporary choice. So, um, yeah, I think that there is this percolation, but we obviously just need a lot more, right? Like it's not enough to percolate. We have to have this tidal wave if we're going to really shift the weight of events.
Absolutely. I hadn't seen the film yet, but that's interesting. Um, I do like how the fact that there is a cop on a yearly basis for me also helps obviously compare and contrast expectations versus reality, an optimistic scenario, pessimistic scenario, that sort of thing, which is it's a useful way of at least assessing, which is it's always imperfect, and lots of critiques obviously are made and should be made about these things, but it's a way of assessing whether we are making progress, whether the progress is fast enough, or whether we're actually making things worse, which I mean, in some ways we also are, not because of the cop itself, but just because of the general direction of how things are going. And okay, so in the book you write, there's this really great quote which I will read out here. Like all fiction that speculates about the future has embedded in it a theory of social change. As it happens, so the Egyptian human rights activist Al Abdel Fattah, in his book "You Have Not Yet Been Defeated," I think it's called. People should check it out. It's basically like a collection of his essay, blog posts, and so on. I should say, since I mentioned him, that he's currently still in prison. His situation is very bad. So I just wanted to bring it up as well. So in his book, he has this sentence. He wrote that the crisis is not in an awareness of the danger of climate change. It is in our inability to imagine alternative ways of organizing our lives. End quote. And that's very useful because I'm thinking, for example, of there was this TV series called One Day at a Time. It was on Netflix for a while and then stopped, whatever. And there's a character in it who she's like she's the queer activist, very self climate conscious, like being the progressive in the family and that sort of thing. And the way it's framed in that TV series, and I'm just using it as an example because it's a very common trope, very common thing, is it's basically like recycle and it's like individual choices, individual things. So everything's about the individual, and while there is a role for the individual, obviously these broader and more structural problems tend to be obfuscated because they require different political imaginaries, and I think this is partly at least what Ala was getting at in that text. I'm curious as to, can you talk about the whole the link between speculations about the future or fictions that speculate about the future and the importance of having a theory of social change, and the kind of follow-up to that is whether we can argue that even when there isn't a theory of social change, or at least when it's not explicitly stated, it's sort of always implicitly there in one way or another.
Yeah. Um, my riff there is really kind of talking about this question of like, is climate fiction like, does it deserve a different shelf than science fiction, right? um, and was the or should we expect, like, is all science fiction, should it be climate fiction now? I think that's a good argument too, but I think there, you know where I come down is that they do different things, and give us sort of a different um, sense of how history unfolds, right? And that those are not the only theories that might drive a speculative work about the future, right? You could you I saw someone on Twitter a while back ask like um, if we have climate fiction, why can't we have housing fiction that is about the future the science fictional future driven by the housing crisis? And I'm like, that's a great idea. Like, there isn't actually a reason why we shouldn't do that. Like, people should go and write that because the more we can um, get out of the our sense that I think science fiction has partially been responsible for instilling in people that for the most part, like technology is going to just happen and society is going to change around technology. And like that's really just like how the history happens. We're going to invent stuff and then we're just going to like live with the consequences of those inventions. I think that's a really bad strategy. I think instead we should recognize that inventing new gadgets doesn't necessarily make our world better, doesn't necessarily lead to um, better policies and outcomes for people, which is something that would be really shocking, right? Like if you showed the alligator graph, which I've been talking about lately, it's a a graph of like productivity and wages um, as that starting in like after in the post-war era, right? Like these two lines go up very steadily and then they diverge in a way that looks like an alligator opening his mouth. um, Productivity keeps going up, meaning the amount of productive value that comes from an hour of a wage laborer's work keeps going up because our machines are getting better, our processes are getting better, but wages stagnate. Those stay the same. The increased gains in productivity are not going to the wage laborers, right? I think if you go back to um, some of the sort of early science fiction, like golden age authors, and show them that graph, they would find it kind of shocking because as much as there's always been a critique of technology in science fiction, I think that there's the sense that these things can be like completely decoupled is really uh, is new, is something that goes against the sort of modernist instinct. Um, so now we've had this for a good um, 50 years, right? I think it first sort of diverges in most versions of the graph in 1972. And we can see that what matters actually uh, is public policy, is levels of unionization, is all these other things that are not just that we have agency over, right? That people can change, that we don't just that are not just a matter of what the sort of technological base of society is. So, for me, this says that we have to go out and uh, that the future can go either way, and it's really our sort of political choices that make the difference. Um, I think there was another part of your question.
Well,
I
it's yeah. Let me repeat it if that's okay. So a lot of so I guess the question is that I suppose the claim that I would make, or the argument I would make, is that ideology is basically everywhere, even when it's not
Yeah,
recognized as such. And so I would watch, and I mean, I don't blame anyone for watching these films. I watch them all the time. That's not the issue. But there are certain, the Avengers, certain superhero movies, and whatnot. And I bring this up because I think it's a frame of reference that most people would understand. Um, there's a certain there is a problem. The problem is usually bad guys are somewhere, solution, good guys destroy bad guys, or something along those lines. And it tends to be individualistic in the sense of these are very special individuals that have superpowers and whatnot. Sure, they need to work together, but ultimately, it's a group of individuals. there's less a focus on structural issues, on problem of the commons, on there's sort of a tendency in a lot of I'm going to say popular fiction, although I'm being very very generalistic here, and it's not necessarily fair, but the trend tends to be, I think, and again, it's not entirely fair, but it's kind of just out there and it's worth talking about, I think, that stuff like income inequality, housing crisis, other forms of inequalities, racism, and whatnot, while they are sometimes brought up, they're not often brought up as something that we can do something about. It's like the future is bad, it's dystopian. You have the rich people somewhere, the poor people elsewhere, and whatnot. And maybe something is done about it then, as in, there's a revolt, there's something which is, always interesting to explore, of course, because to some extent these are realistic scenarios. But there's often less emphasis on how did it get this way and what could have been done to prevent it, i.e., like the solutions are not seen as, or the potential solutions are not seen as worthy of exploration in the same way as the problems, if that makes sense. So I guess the question, if I could phrase it in a question, is um, what happens to fiction when the ideology behind it, if that makes sense, isn't acknowledged as such, as in it's taken as essentially, the normative way of seeing things.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think you characterize it well, that the our sort of some of our core modern myths, right? Like the MCU is, maybe there's a sense of kind of structural problems of the world, but really there's sort of a sense that there's a normal and right equilibrium, and then someone in a crazy costume comes in and disturbs it, and we need heroes to go and eliminate that person with extreme prejudice. Um, and whenever it's funny, like the only ones who ever have ideas in the MCU movies pretty much are the villains, right? Um, Killmonger in Black Panther,
Hmm.
right? He had ideas. He was going to go like arm revolutionary struggles around the world. I'm like, yeah, like come on, Killmonger, let's do it. And it's so funny to see that the like the epic sort of bomb ticking sort of like timer is, are the weapons going to go off, are going to be allowed to like fly off and be given to presumably oppressed peoples that could really use them. um
Oh yeah, so sorry. I read somewhere that essentially what he wanted was to create Black Panthers, like
yeah,
in the U.S. Black Panther group sort of thing, and it was the Black Panther in the Black Panther that was preventing him from doing so. But anyway, yeah, sorry, continue.
yeah, I no, I mean, it's really interesting, and I think that's a case in which the sort of standardized form of the MCU story bumps up against probably some of the real ideology. There's the ideology by committee, and then there's the kind of the ideology of the auteur, and I think we see a little friction there. Maybe not. I mean, maybe the director really does think that, like, I don't know what they did at the end, like a a sort of science and technology like charter school in Oakland that funded by Wakanda is actually the way forward. But and Thanos, he had a policy proposal. He had a policy proposal that nobody engaged in debate with him on.
Hmm.
Like there's zero. No, everyone's just like, you're crazy. You're the mad titan. Nobody ever says like, hey, I don't think that that it's going to work that way. Like, what about all the planets where they aren't, like, people aren't starving? What about like XYZ? Um, that for me was like an unforgivably bad way of doing that movie. Um, and I okay, this is, I mean, only since you brought this up, but on my Medium somewhere, I actually rewrote a treatment of how I would have done Avengers Infinity War.
All right, you
Uh,
did. No, no, bring it up if that's okay. Because it is relevant to our conversation.
yeah. I mean, basically, I make it more sort of comic booky and want Thanos to not be to be like obsessed with the way he is in the comic book of like um, courting Lady Death, right? And not have this genocidal policy proposal that you know no one sort of actually intellectually discusses with him, right? Nobody discusses on his terms, and he isn't willing to like you know he doesn't meaningfully try and win anyone over. Um, so, anyways, if people want to look that up and read it, maybe that'll be fun. It was fun to
I'll
write.
include it. I'll include it in the description.
Sure, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I think to your kind of broader question, um, I guess I think yeah, there's so we do need to be we do need the ideas and the imaginaries, like they are a necessary if not sufficient component, right? I think I think this is an Adrienne Marie Brown line, right? That we're in an imagination battle. That And I don't think that's the only kind of battle we're in, right? Like every struggle, it happens on multiple fronts. There are material aspects, there are ideological aspects, there's just like interpersonal aspects, all like, and those kinds of different dynamics and constraints are ones that I try to highlight in my book, right? That the opening story is called "Politics is Personal," and it really focuses on all the ways in which we have this big, giant diplomatic apparatus, but that the outcomes tend to be swerved by thousands of small human decisions, like like is someone like sick that day, does someone uh can so and so call in a favor, like who has a crush on who, right? All these kind of small, very personal foibles that nonetheless are we try to iron out through this process of committee, but um, the result is a system that has to have like at its heart this kind of inherent mediocrity, right? That will never fully be as I guess as effective as we want, and maybe we just need to uh, admit and acknowledge that that's how institutions work, right? They're always going to be a little less than we want them to be, and the best we can hope for is to kind of keep them like above water in terms of like net positivity. Um, it's and it's a debate that's had in the story between Noah, the perspective character, and Saga, who's like, get out of here with this like let's be friends stuff. I'm trying to do politics, and politics happens when there are millions, not just like a few thousand like uh overeducated and overdressed uh technocrats getting together. So but you know all of this is like the thing in the about the book that I'm really proud of is that all five stories should try basically take aspects of our climate politics that already exist and just carry them forward, blow them up, put them under the magnifying glass. Um, the all five versions of the cop are the part of how the cop is today already, right? Like it already is this place where you're like, you know, trying to you've got 5 minutes and it's like, do I run to the bathroom or do I try to like schmooze of these people, or do I like get a coffee from the free coffee place, right? Like it's already got all these sorts of like personal mediocrities, kind of permeating it. It's already a trade fair, the way it is in the second story, where there are all these startups there trying to like hook the interest of various, you know, important people and sort of promote themselves and their climate solutions. It's already a place where the rich and powerful meet to discuss the fates of millions of people who are not rich and powerful, who don't get much of a voice. It's a place where scientists are going and just kind of calling out how, like, just charting our failure, our descent into the hothouse. And it's a place where people are legitimately gathering to reimagine human life in a truly beautiful way, you know, which is exactly the charge that Egyptian activist you mentioned gave us, right? It is about reimagining human life. It's, you know, that's the, like, there's the Le Guin sort of formulation of that too, right? That um, capitalism seems unsurpassable, but at one point so did the divine right of kings, and we all know how that went. Though I don't know, you look at the UK, they're still pretty into their monarch, I guess. Sorry, just to dig at them for uh, the jubilee nonsense.
Hmm.
Um, and and then there's a second part of that where she says, you know, any human power can be changed by human action, and often that action starts or is catalyzed by art. So, um, you know, I hope she's right. Like, I'm kind of neutral on that. I'm like playing my part on the basis that she is, but I do occasionally fear that, like, oh man, I should just be going out and installing some solar panels instead of writing stories. That would be a more impactful use of my time. Just go plant a tree or sabotage a pipeline or something, right? Um, but these are all. But I think, you know, my core theory is that it has to be uh, a collective endeavor, and that means that, you know, in any collective endeavor, you do have to do some of what you don't like doing, but you also, if it's big and lively and joyous enough, you get to create the things that you're really interested in as well. And for me, that's like writing these kinds of stories. So
Yeah, and talk a bit about it's going to be in the title, but I forgot to actually bring it up as a term. But like the post-normal fiction,
yeah,
how would you explain it for like folks who don't know what it is?
yeah. So this is one of my, I guess, theoretical um, uh, uh, sort of formulations that I try to kind of add to our discussion around these topics in this book. Um, so, in sustainability studies, which is what I did a grad program on at ASU a few years ago, and I wrote this book originally as my master's thesis, I should mention. Uh, so, in sustainability, there's a term called post normal science that is used to kind of frame what sustainability is and how it operates and why it's still a science, even though it's oftentimes, you know, it's about people going out and trying to like work in the real world rather than the lab. And so the argument is they have this graph, and one axis of the graph is stakes and the other axis is uncertainty. And so at a point of zero stakes, zero uncertainty, that's just like running, it's like pure mathematics. That's like experiments in a laboratory where it does not matter what the outcome of the experiment is for the broader world, right? Like a negative result is just as informative as a positive result. You can rerun experiments as many times as you want using different variables to try to like find the solution, right? That is pure research. And as you go out from that zero point on either access or you know, a mix of both, you get into this realm of like applied science. Okay, it kind of matters how we're using science to like uh, create different sorts of infrastructure and technology. You get out to professional consultancy, um, where scientists are like called in by policymakers to like offer judgments, right? Like, there's higher stakes to those decisions. And then eventually you get out into this realm where, yeah, the stakes are high. Um, there's a lot of uncertainty. Often values are in dispute as well. And, time is running out. It's these wicked problems where there might not be one clear solution. In fact, like solutions have different winners and losers. Um, that's a realm they call post-normal science, right? Where you're no longer doing this Kuhnian process of research, theoretical revolution, research to tidy up all the sort of implications of that, right? That's sort of normal Kuhnian science. I'm referring to Thomas Kuhn and the structures. Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Science, of Scientific Revolution. It's like a very useful book to skim once in your life. And in post normal science, you the argument is that it's nothing like that, but you're still doing science, right? We can formulate what we're doing as part of the scientific process and part of scientific inquiry, even though it in some ways it looks nothing like how we've conceived of it. So, I take that basic idea and kind of bring it to the world of fiction and other types of you know content creation, right? And basically say that we're all in this post-normal situation where uncertainty is high. We don't know what the correct actions are or strategies are to get us the future we want, and stakes are really high. We're like, well, things are going to get really bad if we don't make the correct choices, um, and and values are in dispute, right? We're no matter what we do on climate change, there are going to be different winners and losers, um, and our actions really matter, right? Like it's a situation in which we're not just creating stories based on our own just what sounded cool to us. We're not just creating stories based on what the market wants, but we're also, as I think a lot of writers are, motivated by a kind of like, I need to be a part of the solution, right? And I think so I call it post-normal fiction when you are writing fiction that feels like it has this intent to impact the real world around these wicked problems, and that recognizes the stakes of the narratives and imaginaries that stories help create, and is like deliberate about doing so, about the role that we're doing so. So that's so for me that's kind of one of, I guess, the contributions of the book, this concept. And different people found it interesting, and so that's been really gratifying. I think the some people have talked about sort of the normal being this like kind of capitalist realism zone, and um, the post-normal kind of showing that that's sort of that's limited. I think that as time goes on, I've talked about it more in terms of, yeah, this notion of at a certain point we got into the mindset that every all of our actions were just going to be sort of like perturbations of a market, right? These are just going to be market exchanges, and the market, like, in some ways, like, contains the energy, right? We You go in and you buy a commodity, there's less of the commodities, so the price of the rest like increase, right? Like that's all. That's how the market is supposed to work, as this like buffer to contain human and extra human inputs, right? Okay, but that is no longer the case, right? Like the market cannot contain all human inputs because the market has decided that a bunch of human inputs are particularly carbon dioxide are fine to dump into the atmosphere, and as a result, we're changing the planet and getting all of these all these externalities are going to start battering down our door, are already battering down our door. So, um, it's about kind of recognizing that there's something else going on here other than we're all creating products and selling them and having them sort of judged and evaluated and given a price and and sort of sold at the price at which they should be, right? Like we're doing things that actually matter, that are not just market interactions, and that have consequences for the rest of humanity and for every generation of humanity that's on the way. So
Yeah, I mean it's like the difference between fiction that is actionable in some sense and fiction that is not necessary. So like and this is an example I've given a number of times. Like when I have read Lord of the Rings or stuff like that, I don't necessarily read this with the um, knowledge or what have you. Like I don't necessarily read this and think, oh well, this is very useful for 2022, or this is if we don't do this or we don't. I mean, there's some critique of society. You can think about power to some extent. A lot of stories do that, but it's more like the escapism that I get or the value I get in reading Lord of the Rings is just it's the escapism almost for its own sake. It's like a way of expanding the imagination, and that in and of itself is a good in that sense. But
yeah,
it's the
I mean,
yeah.
fantasy in particular, right, is very conservative
Mm-hmm.
in ideology. I mean, this was something I was reading about this yesterday in the Countercraft Substack by Lincoln Michelle, I think, um, and yeah, made the point that in fantasy, any attempt to like change society is viewed as uh, a threat that has to be like heroically beaten back. And like it, anyone who you know, it, you never have like social reformers in high fantasy, uh, in high fantasy stories. You only have dark lords, right? And in Lord of the Rings, it's very coded as industrialization too, right? Like in the orcs and the Uruk-hai are all like in these like coal smeared factories and that are threatening the pristine lives of the good English hobbits on the countryside. So, uh, yeah, I think, but and if that is fundamentally a conservative view of social change, and well, it's and it is very escapist, right? I mean, it's the same. The I think a lot of fiction is inherently like this. It's detective fiction is always like someone has like perverted the social contract, someone's violated the social contract, but once the mystery is solved, right? Like once you know who the culprit is, it is uh just like then it's a clear path to enacting justice, right? When usually getting the justice is much harder than finding out who did it, right? Um, and figuring out what even is just in in that in our very unjust and unequal context. Um, anyway, sorry, I just wanted to spiel a little bit there.
No. This is excellent. Thanks. Some reason I was thinking also of Princess Mononoke, which the other example I was going to give of. It is also in that sense you have this uh, Tolkien-esque or whatever, like fear of industrialization, or at least skepticism towards industrialization. But in some senses, also slightly more nuanced in the sense that you end up kind of understanding whether um, the villagers who were following whatever her name was, um, yeah, you kind of understand where they come from. And so there's this sort of a more nuanced take there. But anyway, the reason I kind of bring it up is that it's sort of the I guess is the and that's probably what I will bring up again in that public discussion I mentioned before that I'm gonna have next week on like from the IPCC to solar punk. It's something that I feel needs to be taken more seriously, and I guess this is to some extent why I'm doing episodes like this one, making the case that something like solar punk, which is what I try to focus on these days, isn't just escapism a la Lord of the Rings, as I mentioned. It's definitely not conservative, which arguably Lord of the Rings definitely is, or at least elements of it is there. Um, it's more really about it's like a response to something, it's a answer to cyberpunk or a challenge to cyberpunk. It's a response to the modern world and the particular configurations of the modern world and how it doesn't have to be this way, that the future doesn't have to be the present. It's that whole like what was it, I actually wrote it down while we are talking, like there were better futures in the past.
Mm.
Is that argument that at the very least, when the original Star Treks, the whole like we could go to the moon, therefore we can go somewhere else, we can do these things. The future was kind of, there was this idea, it was at least, with all the criticism that we can muster against this, like there was at least something to move forward to. There was at least something, you know uh, the universe could be explored. There was some path forward in that sense. Whereas at some point, and I've read arguments that this is a kind of a result of capitalist realism and instead of like neoliberalism, that sort of thing. The idea that anything that isn't outside of the market and the magic of the market and the invisible hand of the market and that sort of thing, even it kind of percolated, that realism, that capitalist realism, even percolated in fiction like the MCU that you mentioned before. Like even as you mentioned, Black Panther, a film that has, it's kind of a fascinating. I've seen it a number of times because it has not solar punky necessarily, but like certain elements of it are there, but at the same time, it's not. It's still it's a hierarchical society, and the big solution that's sort of proposed in the end. And I hope this isn't a spoiler. I'm assuming most people have seen it by now. Is like we'll open some outreach somewhere and we'll talk to the UN and we'll join the UN and we will export our technology, but like it's not really explained how that's going to happen without imperialist power kind of coming in and taking it from you. But it's a different kind of, anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but the reason why I kind of focus on these things from time to time is just this idea that it doesn't have to be this way. Like if a story is in a certain way, the story could be differently, and that's why could be different. Like the reason why I like the fact that you have five different stories is that in that sense, it's this is 2054, this is COP, this is Buenos Aires. This might be what it looks like if we have what's it called, SSP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And obviously you're not even suggesting that these are the only five futures. Obviously there's like multitudes of futures, and the idea is that those futures depend on the present. And I think this is sort of what I get out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I mean, one of the scary things about writing a book that sort of fundamentally says, okay, we our choices are going to uh, nudge us into one of these scenarios or another, or some other like wilder thing, is like, okay, like I wrote that at a time where it felt like uh, yeah, our sort of options are open, but our options are closing, right? Like we are running out of time, and we do have to act. We do have to sort of get the numbers down. The emissions numbers down. We got to get the renewable energy up. We've got to, you know, it's a big project, and it can go either way, and that's really scary. Um, I think. Um, I think though that one thing that I hope is in the spirit of the book is that even though we occasionally hear we have like 36 months to save the world, or we have 30. I saw one that was like we have 30 weeks to save the planet to like pass, and I sometimes I think those are mobilizing. Sometimes I think they're kind of demobilizing, demoralizing. Um, but the point is, this, to borrow a phrase from my friend Jay Springett, right? Like we have 10 years to save the world, but it's going to take 100 years to do it, and it's going to be like politics and discussion and tweaking our strategy and keeping people on board and fighting off the various ways in which it tries to be co-opted, um, the various ways in which, and reforming it all throughout, right? Like there's no point at which this stops being politics, in which like we are now locked in forever to the question of how will we manage the planet's atmosphere, right? Right now we're trying to just stabilize it because it is a runaway train and we are trying to find the brakes. We're trying to figure out how to turn off the engine that is like accelerating us towards the cliff. But even if we manage to do that, we're still going to have to decide on like some basic things about the train. We're going to have to decide where it goes, where it stops, um, you know, the what temperature we like keep the planet at, right? What is the optimum level of atmospheric carbon if we were to stop emitting carbon and hopefully build up a big climate repair infrastructure, like a whole bunch of carbon removal machines and other natural systems that can get a lot of carbon back out of the atmosphere so it can stop warming the planet, right? So it put in a place where it's not contributing to either radiative forcing or we also don't want it in the ocean because that's how we're acidifying the ocean, which is also a catastrophe, right? But so we put it away, but then it's like, okay, but now we've got like a nozzle, right? Like if we have this stuff in storage, we can always release it again. What is like, how far down do we go? Do we want to go to exactly to like pre-industrial? Pre-industrial was kind of cold, right? Like the industrial age started like kind of coming out of an ice age, a little mini one. Um, Maybe we want to keep it like around like I don't know 315 or something like this, right? Um, but if we do that, then wherever we set the number, there's going to be winners and losers. This is going to be something that's going to be debated constantly, even in the scenario in which we are successful at this particular moment of like starting to up the basic set of actions that we need. And in the scenarios in which we're not successful, man, it still matters if we like how much carbon we put out, right? Like the difference between 2 degrees and 2.5 degrees is enormous. The difference, like every ton of carbon, every molecule of carbon does make a difference. So even if we sort of catastrophically fail to like win climate action, man, there is a whole band of failure and different valences of failure, right? Like there's the types of failure in which um, it's a failure may because power has come into the hands of has been concentrated. Wealth has been concentrated into smaller and smaller hands, and there's types of failure in which it's like institutions break down or um, societies just like lose their sense of self. Like there's just all kinds of ways that can go wrong and all kinds of ways that can go right, and normative choices to be made along the way um, about how what kind of like people we want to be and what kind of society we want to live in. So that, I mean, for me, that's kind of the core message that I try and bring to all my work, and particularly this book, is that just like politics never stops, right? And I mean, this is kind of funny. I was reading like a review of my book today by Michael Fink, And he made a really good point that I wish I had made in the book, that a lot of climate fiction that is more apocalyptic tends to be this kind of like deluge, have this kind of mythos of the deluge, right? That where it's sort of sinful industrial society washed away by a wrathful God and nature, and it's this kind of re-inscribing of Christian mythology or biblical mythology onto the modern situation, and not being a situation in which uh, yeah, in which politics continues, where you know uh, we 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 don't think that, like, sometimes you see jokes about this, right? You see cartoons joking about like the debates about like who which animals Noah led on the ark, right? But that's like a real debate that we have about like who goes on the endangered species list, right? Like what species do we think are worthy of protecting, or need our help, right? Like we constantly have those that make those decisions, and uh, so it's just gonna be like that. It's not gonna be this like one and done apocalypse, and we just spend the rest of our days sort of like bemoaning the that our predecessors, had um, been so foolish as to incur God's wrath, right? Like, anyways, that's a bit of a rant, but hopefully a useful one.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I often think of that movie that came out a billion years ago, like The Day After Tomorrow, and
Mm-hmm.
the how I think it's very indicative of a lot of what we might call like climate apocalypse stuff. And the thing about The Day After Tomorrow is it kind of portrays climate change as a thing that's gonna happen on essentially a day or like a few days or whatever, and then we will learn our lesson. The president is gonna come on TV and say Mother Nature has taught us a lesson, and we will, be better after that. As if the fact that we're even if that is the case, the the consequences that led to those few days of catastrophes will still be with you even after those few days. Therefore, there will be more days like that. But anyway, and the reason why I bring it up is that there is, or at least it's sort of like, so the reason I have a lot of issues with um, apocalyptic scenarios, although they're not necessarily wrong. It's more that how useful can they be? And this is all mobilizing versus demobilizing that you mentioned before. And I will just say quickly that I had recently Alyssa Hall on. That's a few episodes ago. The topic, sorry, the podcast is called Climate Narratives That Go Beyond the Apocalypse. And it's based on this 2019 essay that she wrote for LitHub called Hope Punk and Solar Punk on Climate Narratives That Go Beyond the Apocalypse, hence the title. And it's about her, how she, as a science teacher, talks about climate change to her students who are, I think, mostly in high school, and how this whole like we have 13 months, we have whatever it is, how it's interpreted if in 30 months you turn 16 or in 30 months you turn 18, or and how what can you do about an information, like how can your brain even process an information like that? So it's sort of that, and this is why I sort of see, for me, fiction, like the good kind of fiction, at least the fiction I think is more interesting, like this book and solar punk books and hope punk, climate fiction, other stuff, what have you. And they don't necessarily have to be positive, don't get me wrong. Like it's there is a role for dystopias, there is a role for pessimistic futures, what have you. It doesn't have to all be rosy and good and whatever. It's more that it allows us to have different things to latch on to when reality gets a bit too much, and that's what it is for me. It doesn't mean that if I, and this again example I brought up a billion times, but when I watch Star Trek, I don't necessarily think, oh, this is what the future is going to be like, or necessarily that this is how the future should be either. It's more that, oh, this is seems to be a possible future. I think about it, and I then end up comparing, contrasting with our present, and which things I would like it to be more Star Trekky and which things I would like to be less. It allows me to have different kind of yeah, a different framework. I guess I'm just repeating myself, like a different framework on approaching the present, essentially. So yeah, I didn't even have a question with that. Just a thought. Yeah, I mean, okay, so we sort of wind down and wrap up a bit. I wanted
Sure.
to ask you. Well, I had one more question. One sec. Yeah, just so that you already talked about it, so you don't have to get into it too much. But I guess if we can bring up again, or like a kind of last thing, the how you marry, in some sense, practice-based research with fiction, because there's something that, it's definitely in the spirit of everything we already talked about. But if you can kind of flesh it out a bit more, that's okay, because I like the topic.
Yeah. Well, no, it's a good question because it started out, as I mentioned, as my master's thesis at ASU, and I formulated it as this pure. I was not doing an MFA, right? I was not. Uh, I needed to do my thesis could not just be a work of fiction that was judged purely on its merits as fiction. I was doing an MA, so there had to be this non-creative component to it, which was good. Was very helpful. I mean, I chose that program on purpose, and the sort of research projects I came up with initially was to use a methodology called practice-based research to explore the sort of challenges and opportunities of trying to write really rigorous climate fiction, right? Of trying to write about climate not just sort of from my own head, but guided by uh, scientific models, scientific by scholarly scenarios, and like some of the specifics about you know very few of which are in the book, right? But I think percolate the throughout the world building of like some, you can go onto the SSP database and see what each SSP implies about like population in different countries and things like that, right? So some of those like data points are like informed my world building. Um, so practice based research basically means that like you're a creative and you are studying your own creative process, right? You is a purely subjective form of research, right? You are analyzing what's going on inside your own head as you do whatever it is you do, right? Like be it like dance, paint, whatever, right? Then you go and you reflect on and you reflect on the you know the internal on the mechanisms of that, right? Like you kind of provide a meta commentary, right? So the research is a common and you consider the creative product part of the research. So the sort of the research then becomes the movie plus the director's commentary, right? Like and as a whole, you can say something about the creative process in a particular way. So that was where I started, and I did do a bunch of that, though I think in the over the course of the project, settling it into the SSPs, settling it into the cop, all of which kind of ended up giving the stories a little more of a scholarly uh, bent, right? Like there's some very academic discussions that are kind of like had in the bounds of fiction within those stories, and hopefully in an entertaining way. Um, but yeah, it's really interesting. It's hard, like this post normal fiction stuff. That's where I came up with that term. I think is really difficult to do um, because you kind of are constantly uh, questioning just how impactful it can be, right? Like it we're- it requires a lot of faith to do this strategy, right? Like to say that like this is the thing that I can do that can influence um, are that can like help save the world the most. Well, like okay, my strategy is I'm going to write a book and then people are going to read the book and that book is going to change their actions so that they're then going to uh, impact the political process in a different way, like maybe they're going to demand action from their politicians. And then those politicians are going to uh, pass policies, hopefully, as a result of the pressure or the desires of their constituents. And those policies are going to like subsidize different kinds of infrastructure and regulate others. And as a result, then we will build a bunch of solar panels and shut down a bunch of coal plants, right? That is based. That is like the sort of theory of change. Like, oh man, there's a lot of links in that chain that could be weak, right? And I mean, I think we all know where the links are, right? It's the politicians, the politicians passing stuff. But nonetheless, I think the so the I guess the other thing that like came up as I was sort of thinking about this in the process was it's not just a matter of do we tell people to like call their senators or something, right? That it's a matter of informing the populace about the institutions that are making decisions for them, right? People need to know about the COP because the decisions made at the COP are going to affect every single person on the planet and every generation to come. Um, so, tens of thousands of people go to the COP every year, but that's like a tiny sliver of humanity, right? More people just need to have a sense of the vibe of these places and understand like the mechanisms by which they do politics. Because I think when we understand that how these things work, then we're more empowered to go out and make demands of them. We're more empowered to um, think about how we want to affect them and what it helps us be more strategic. So it's not just a matter of I think sort of motivating people. It's a matter of honing our praxis, and that's one place where I think stories can be really useful, right? And where I think solar punk is really valuable because they don't solar punk stories don't just tell you do something about climate change. They give you a sense of what those things can you can do might be, right? um, Both in terms of like mitigation and in terms of adaptation, how to prepare now to like live through disasters, right? um, how to like different, you know very interesting sort of systems that we could embrace to reimagine core parts of our society, our agriculture, our transportation, how these things are entwined with things like our family dynamics, our community sort of agreements, right? Um, all that is stuff that's like solar punk loves to explore, and that I think is like so valuable.
Yeah, obviously, completely agree with that. Um, okay, so as with all the like with every episode, if that's okay, what are three books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why those three?
Um, yeah. So, um, well, obviously, I think the other big uh, work that is like mine, that is like this one, is Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Um, I email him occasionally, so I get to call him Stan, uh, which is another one of these kind of like story, like climate realist, climate solutions based books that are about the political process that we are like actually using right now. Uh, I would love to see more of these written. Um, but people should definitely read it, right? It's like a book that's just full of great stuff. It's full of like really moving moments and stories. Um, and it's some in some ways it's like a fantasy of like how we get out of this, and in some ways it's also like very doable, practicable path, sort of map. um and my book doesn't like give a map, right? Like my book is even in the utopian scenario, like I just kind of hint at things that happened to get us on the right track. But he really dives into what some of those might be. um and then like go and sort of read is coming, because like all books, right? Like what they get written and then they get published like a year and change or two later, and then you like spend a year being like, okay, had I written this book now, I would have written it XYZ ways. And he's written a bunch of stuff about that. That's really interesting. Um, I would also say people should read Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is just a really, I think, important piece of discussion about climate action and climate strategy, and from an activist perspective. It's it's very European in context, right? So I know some Americans have like gotten mad at at the book for not sort of sufficiently talking about anti-pipeline activism in particularly the indigenous American context. But but I think kind of diving into the these questions of just how we shut down the fossil fuel apparatus are really important. And let me see, I'm glancing at my bookshelf here. Um, well, this is a this is a little bit of self promotion, but there's a really interesting volume that just came out in Australia from an Australian press called 12th Planet Press, called Phase Change: Imagining Energy Futures. I have a story in that book co-written with Corey J. White, but but there's also a bunch of really interesting stories by a ton of other super great authors: Paolo Bacigalupi, Craig Eakin, Kat Sparks, Paul Graham Raven, are just some of the ones that I know. And I really like it as a project of saying that, like, let's not just have stories that are like pro or anti climate action, right? Like let's have stories that show the next set of debates, right? That show what we're going to be arguing about at a future point in the process. And so I think there's a bunch in there that are really interesting and useful, including my own story. So does that work as in terms of
Yeah,
book
yeah,
review,
absolutely.
book recommendations?
I've only read the first one, Kim's book, Kim Stanley Robinson's book. It's a really, really good book. I'm in this kind of like a climate anxiety discussion group. We meet once every couple of weeks, and it's one of the books that I recommended we like the others read, because it's it has its flaws, its critiques, what have you, but it's again, I find it very useful to think of different scenarios as being different scenarios being presented as realistic ones. Like this might happen, like this might be a way forward, what have you. Not necessarily this is the best way forward or whatever, but like this is a way forward. And just thinking of, it's almost like exercising that muscle of applying futurism or science fiction and that sort of thing to the present. So I do appreciate that book. The second one, I have heard of it. I know of the polemics around it and whatnot, but I haven't read it yet. But definitely, it looks good. And the third one, I hadn't heard of it until now. So that's amazing that you recommended it, and I will definitely check it out. Um, Other than that, are there like, where can people find you? Plug your stuff, that sort of thing.
Yes. Uh, yeah, I have a website, www.andrewdanahudson.com, that has pretty much all my stuff on it. Probably the best way to follow my work is via my newsletter, which is solarshades.club. And I'm taking the summer off from the newsletter because I'll be at a workshop and just won't have the capacity, but I'll be back in August. Um, and I use it to kind of write about a combination of things like we talked about here, a little like stuff about my garden, little just sort of stuff from my life and my process. Um, I don't know. It's an evolving project, but please do sign up for it, because it will be the best way to keep up with what I do. And I usually publish every other Sunday. So, and yeah, I'm on Twitter. I don't tweet that much because it's a bad platform. But you can follow me on there. I'm Andrew D. Hudson. I'm on Instagram. I'm on I'm pretty easy to find if you use my full name around. And yeah, if you see a piece of fiction with my name on it, please read it. I am inches away from finishing my next novel, and we'll see if hopefully that one gets. It's not a climate book particularly. It's a pandemic book,
Hmm.
but it was like the one that I needed to write over the last year,
Sure, yeah.
and hopefully that'll eventually be out for people too.
But amazing. I mean, I'm a subscriber to the newsletter, so I recommend it as well.
Thank you.
Okay, well, on that note, Andrew, thanks again. Thanks for coming on again.
Oh, it's great to see you. Great to be on again. Always a pleasure.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.